Hello, you're about to watch my interview with Anthony Oliveira, PhD, culture critic, and writer of many Marvel books, as well as the novel Dayspring. We chatted all about Anthony's connection to superheroes going all the way back to his childhood, why the X-Men films were so important to him when he was coming out, and what it's like to be a writer of superhero stories today. Check the description for links to all of Anthony's books and his live show in Toronto, and for a link to my full video about the power and the legacy of the X-Men films. And now, on with the interview!
I'm Anthony Oliveira. I'm a PhD culture critic. Dumpster Raccoon is the way I usually introduce myself. I'm a writer. I write books and I work for Marvel Comics, writing stuff for them too.
So, what was your connection to X-Men when you were young? The comic, the animated series, whatever else was out
Oh.
there?
I grew up in the suburbs of Toronto, and I remember very distinctly when I got hooked on the X-Men. I was at a Scholastic book fair, and I really wanted some Spider-Man stuff because that was what I was into. And they didn't have any, but they had a book just said X-Men with Wolverine on the cover, and I was like, I'm gonna get this. I kind of know about the Marvel Universe. And it was just like an explainer of like who the characters are and some of the history. And I was obsessed. I read it cover to cover over and over again. And that sent me hurtling into comic book stores to find these characters. And it was like magic, like seeing all these characters I'd only read descriptions of coming to life. And like the depth of the universe was so engaging, and like it became an obsession of mine. And it just, the metaphor of the text really lit up my childhood brain at a moment I really needed it. I was queer, I didn't know it, but I knew something was wrong. And the idea of the X-Men as a place where it was a community that knew the world hated it, but they were taking care of each other and they were friends and putting the lie to these narratives about them that were out there. And then the X-Men cartoon hit, and I was sold for life.
Do you remember, like, as a kid reading that book, like, what are some of the details that stood out to you about the characters?
I, the thing that really grabbed my imagination was Magneto. Like, he really was the character that was a lightning rod for me. I've always been kind of obsessed with this kind of character who has lived through it and is insistent it will not happen again, and is willing to be the radical die-hard member of the community who pushes the furthest on behalf of that community and is kind of willing to be the monster of that community in its public face. And as a kid, I think I really responded to, I think it was the power fantasy is a charged term, but I think it was the refusal to just make these characters the victim of history, that they were going to fight back and they were going to mold the way that the future would treat them, and that they were going to be active participants in their own narrative. That was really important to me as a kid.
What do you remember from, like, 2000, 2003 when those first
Oh.
X-Men movies are coming out?
Well, as I said, I grew up in Toronto, so I was commuting from the suburbs into the city core every day, and the movie was filming all around us at the time. Every single day, I passed on the commuter train, um, the Gooderham and Wart Distillery District in Toronto, which is the older red brick zone that they were turning into Auschwitz for the opening sequence every day. So it was like flooded with mud, and you could see all the extras in these very upsetting costumes filming scenes. And I was obsessed. I was on the web every day, getting updates, seeing costume designs, seeing where they were filming. Even just rewatching the movie for this, it's like, oh, I know every location here. Like the X-Men in that moment also became this sort of this like psychic geometry map of the city I was growing up in. So it like the imaginative and the real sort of just merged for me in a way that was really uh magic for me.
Boy, it's really blending the metaphor and the reality. Like,
Yeah.
talk about metaphor as sort of a compass that's drawing a circle around an idea. There, like
Yeah.
the compass is like narrowing and narrowing.
Yeah, like the opening scene with Magneto and Xavier talking in a hall, that's Roy Thompson Hall here in Toronto. Like the mansion is partly Casa Loma interiors, but the exterior is just out in the suburbs, right where I lived. My sister got married there, like where the where the jet comes out of the basketball court and where Rogue gets tricked into running away by Mystique. Like that was all sort of spaces I knew as a kid. So it was really like, wow, like the X-Men are really they have an effect in the world. And I think that was also the effect of the movie. Like um it provided a metaphor for talking about issues with my friends and issues in larger spaces about like queer acceptance, disability acceptance that I think is sort of the main function of metaphor. Like it let a bunch of kids in a Catholic all boys school have a way to think about difference that was counter to the narratives we were receiving as a kid.
Yeah, what do you remember from the? It must have been a thrill when that movie came out. Like, I
Oh,
assume you saw it in theaters. Like, what do you
saw
recall
it
of that?
midnight opening night, yeah, and many times after that, for sure. Um, it's funny watching the movie again now and sort of recouping that sense. I think one of the real virtues of this script, David Hayter's script in this, is that it is so thoroughgoingly obsessed with articulating the way this is a minority community rallying together and building community spaces and interventions for each other um, that are positive, that are affirming, that are safe. It was really, I think it's kind of weird now because the show uh, like what the movie really did is it reinvented the way we think about Xavier's school. It really was in the 90s just like a bunch of 20 something, 30 somethings with superpowers living in this mansion. But the movie really also shifted the way the comics think about it by sort of populating it with students, populating it with young people. We hear from Xavier in the film that like most of these kids are runaways. They came here because they have nowhere else to go. And like the sense of Xavier's school as a refuge, as a space to learn about yourself and feel something other than rejection was really the psychic space of that really meant a lot to me as a kid. Really, really gave me an escape at a moment when I did feel alone and I did feel isolated and I couldn't imagine anything better than this. A space where you weren't just a monster and you weren't just the thing everyone hated. And I think that that really is the enduring legacy of the film, both in the cultural imagination, but also in the comics ever since. Like, um, really, since that run and since the Grant Morrison run that followed it, it's changed the way X-Men and the mutant metaphor functions, I think.
You mentioned that it was a really potent way for you and your friends, like these teenagers going to a Catholic school, to talk to each other about, you're talking about this cool movie that just came out, but also a little bit more. What do you remember from those conversations?
I think that it gave me a framework for coming out in a lot of ways. It gave me a sense just in my own interior that like I'm not wrong just because everyone says I'm wrong. I'm not wrong just because the authority figures in my life say I'm wrong. Um, and I think that that really did give a framework for my friends too, to understand that, like, I mean, it's hard for people to remember how homophobic the late 90s, early 2000s were. Like, all of our language was sort of suffused with, like, that's gay. And, like, there was only, I didn't really grow up in a moment where I could see queer culture, but I could see texts like this, and it gave me a way to sort of find queer culture and imagine what it might be like. So that was its real potency for me.
Yeah, and you were yourself, like you mentioned, like the school as a, they say that it's a place for runaways. I know that you yourself were a runaway at
I
one point.
was, yeah, for a minute. Yeah, between X-Men and Buffy, I kind of had the way to think of ways to survive. I did sort of run away, much like Buffy did, to hang out with a friend who ran a Buffy the Vampire Slayer message board in Ohio. I took a bus for 9 hours. Rogue's sort of cross-country adventure. I sort of performed in reverse out of Canada down into the United States. Um, and yeah, it I think it's hard for me to remember just how straitjacketed that time in my life was and how desperate the feeling of the need to escape can be. And I think that what this film does, it shows the desperation of it, but it also lets it be something heroic. There is something very brave, as Rogue says, like it wouldn't be an adventure. Something very brave about venturing out into the world to find your people. Um, I think that that's, and also just like the infighting of those people too, like the richness it gives to the various responses to the world at large, I think is one of the real virtues of the X-Men mythos too. Um, this film, I think, is the moment when you can feel the critique of Xavier's dream really starting to also rise. When Wolverine turns to Storm and says, like, you're fighting for a world that hates and fears you. Are you sure you're on the right side? I think that that's something that X-Men has really spent the last 25 years growing out of is the sense of like uh Xavier's sort of centrist, we can show them we deserve dignity, is treated really for not the first time, but in a serious way as something worthy of critique here. I think the film cheats a little by making Magneto's plan A not work, like the mutant stuff won't work, and B, his use of Rogue as sort of this hostage. It stacked the deck against him, but his critique of like it will happen again. I have seen it happen again, and the second film really picks this up. Is like, well, you haven't given us a way to fight back yet. You're just sort of policing your own community. And I think that that's one of the things X-Men 1 and X2 really gave. Like the way Magneto basically becomes an ally for the second film, um, is I think an important bit of work that this franchise did for this metaphor.
I love to see Magneto working with them, and also the conclusion of the second one, where Xavier says, at the very end, that final scene where they're in the president's, the Oval Office,
Uh-huh.
and Xavier says this isn't a threat. However, he has just invaded the White House. He has
Yeah.
brought with him the man who previously, just a few days ago, tried to murder the president.
Uh-huh.
It is such an obvious show of force. And, it's not just Magneto conceding, like, well, maybe I have to work with you. It's also Xavier saying, all right, it's time for an escalation. Magneto says, it looks like they're not playing by your rules. Maybe it's time to play by your own, or play by theirs. Um, and yeah, I think we do see sort of a deconstruction of how hard those lines are drawn for both of them.
Yeah, yeah. I think that, I mean, X-Men was created by a bunch of straight white men, right? And it spent a long time um, struggling with the way, even in an imaginative way, it was othering of these characters and their willingness to lie down and protect the president and fight for people on the street who were cursing at them, was a thing that it struggled to imagine itself past. There's a moment at the end of Grant Morrison's run, which was very heavily inspired by these films, where Xavier confronts Magneto and says, we've been fighting for so long, maybe it's time to hear what these kids have to say. And it sort of became the direction that took a long time for the series to live up to. I think it did most recently in the Krakoan age, when both its imaginative space and its creative community started to be something other than the straight white people who had written it for so long. Morrison was queer, and then we've had so many queer creators and other minority groups working on the books that recognize the need to add some teeth to this original, very like pre-Stonewall vision of what Xavier's dream is. Um, that I think the films really paved the way for.
That's such a good way to describe it. A pre-Stonewall vision. It does feel very, not to, I'm certainly not saying this is wrong, but I'm thinking of other people working in queer liberation. Obviously, it
Mhm.
wasn't called that at the time, but
Sure.
like, Harry Hay and Frank Kameny, who want us to dress in nice clothes, or,
Yes.
Frank Kameny, dress nice, or Harry Hay, we're just moving out to the country and they're never going to see us again.
Yeah.
This like, we don't bother
The,
them, they won't bother us. Even that is, I think, maybe a little optimistic.
yeah, the what is it? The Mattachine Society?
Yeah,
Is that
yeah.
yeah, like there is something very Mattachine about Xavier, right? Like he's both those things, right? He's going to wear a suit, he's going to present himself well, he's going to build this kind of, yeah, as you say, a refuge in the countryside where we'll all be safe. It has a kind of reminds me of the end of Howard's End, right? E.M. Forster being like, we can build this sort of queer commune on the outside of the city, but we still see the red rust rim of the city coming out to meet us. Um, I think that Magneto is, by virtue of his own sort of trauma, he is not and sort of struggles to be the next wave, right? He can't be Stonewall. He is so aggressively recognizing and playing out the politics of the 30s and 40s, right? But um, what X-Men and critiques of Xavier are easy to make, right? Like, and I certainly have made them. He is not just in the founding of the school, but everything about the way he teaches these kids is quite let's all blend in, let's all fit in, let's all play nice, right? Like he hides Beast's big feet. He makes Warren strap down his wings. He's going to help Cyclops control and hide his beams. He's going to give Nightcrawler a holographic inducer to conceal his appearance. Um, he doesn't well imagine a way for mutants to exist in the world on their own terms. He always imagines a way to make the mutant fit best into the world as it is, right? Like and sort of the way that Rogue is treated is part of this too, right? Like she has to sort of cover her body, right? There's a very easy queer reading of this need for Rogue to conceal and cloak her difference, right? That we see throughout Xavier's vision. And it is notable, I think, in this film, the first film, for example, that the more visibly legible mutants are all on Magneto's side, right? Like
Mhm.
Mystique and Toad and Sabretooth are all, you look at them and you know they don't fit in. Obviously, Mystique is quite complicated about this, but she articulates this exact thing, right? She says, like, people like you are the reason I was scared to go to school as a child. Like, um, Xavier's vision doesn't hold these people well, and the best it can do is kind of hide them at the school. I think the film does a good job in casting the students, the sort of nameless tweens we see around. Many of them are quite visibly different, right? And not even always in a mutated way, right? They're just like there's some very heavy children, there's some very skinny children, there's just some weird looking kids. Like we understand not just at a queer level, but like at a disability level, what's going on here. But Xavier just wants them to fit, and
Mhm.
I don't think the horizon of his vision ever gets much better than that. This sort of blossoms into full bloom in the way Jean's difference sort of becomes the great critique of it, that he encounters Jean and immediately tries to tamp down her difference to this sort of apocalyptically explosive level. Um, that I think, as much as X3 is not a favorite film of mine, her confrontation with Xavier does feel like a moment where the films are thinking about this.
I do think that in these films, it's sort of a double-decker metaphor where one of the decks is the outsider being persecuted by a cruel government with an agenda of exploiting difference to,
Yeah.
advance their own, just hey, scapegoating. Look at those guys. They're not like us. Vote for me. I'll protect you from the weirdos. And then there's also this other metaphor where they are many of the mutants legitimately quite dangerous. Like, if you think
Mhm.
about it, there is a threat to some of these people, especially, let's say they had just have a bad day. And that, I think that there's a metaphor there of, that you could apply to, say, gun control, for example. Like maybe there is a threat here that needs to be monitored. But these are people. Also, it's not an inanimate object. And so I do think that you have a choice about like which of those ramps you want to take to to explore as a metaphor. And I'm really grateful that the films are really interested in, at least the first two, exploring being a marginalized class essentially.
Right. Yeah, it is. It is a difficulty I think that is baked into the mutant metaphor. Um, because on one hand, you do have sort of the power fantasy of like, well, you're different, but look at how your difference is a power, and look at how your difference empowers you, right? And I do think as a kid, I really responded to that. And as an adult, I also recognize like my queerness is more than just a thing I want people to accept. It actually is a source of tremendous power and tremendous force in my life, that I think is accurate. Um, and that I think also at a disability level, a lot of us recognize like my autism is not just a thing that society needs to learn to accept, but actually does have a tremendous shaping force in how I think and how I behave and how I perceive the world that can feel like, a superpower, right? As much as that is complicated too. Um, but then you do have the problem of like, well, I can't explode in a crowded space. And like there is something of the metaphor that encodes the centrist fear of the difference too, right? Like that you are these people need our love and acceptance, but wow, they are scary too. And I think it is kind of a permanent problem in the text. That I think partly is just part of the genre convention. It doesn't bother me in particular, but it is something to be aware of, I think, when writing these characters and writing this universe, that like, well, that's not really how it would work. Like, and that's not really how it's lived in the world. Um, I think when the metaphor is treated as almost a trauma response to the communities that are suffering, then it works. I always think of Godzilla as sort of a way to metaphorize and think about the traumas of Hiroshima and the traumas of World War II in a way that is both active and potent and powerful, but also because it is controlled in this quite sort of hilarious. Like Godzilla is funny. Like Godzilla is iconic. Godzilla is not the thing we all survived, right? And the gauze of that is helpful and I think useful. And one of the reasons whenever I see fan communities saying things like, do we need the mutant metaphor when we can just include Black people and Indigenous people and queer people in the text without a metaphor? Then what's the metaphor doing? And I think one of the things the metaphor does is like, you can have Senator Kelly talking about mutant registration or the mutant cure or whatever, and everyone understands what you're talking about in the real world, but you're not constantly re-traumatizing your audience by talking about the very real problems they're facing.
Yeah, actually, I'm curious about that. Like, how do you approach as somebody who's telling stories? The metaphor serves such a useful purpose in 2000 when you're
Mm,
not going to have a blockbuster tentpole movie about queer life and a coming out scene or like a teenager's coming out to his
yeah.
family. And okay, great, here's $100 million to make that film. Um, Times are a little bit different. I'm not saying we're going to have a mainstream movie now like that, but now that you do simply have characters who are queer and they talk about their queerness openly, what is the job of the metaphor then?
I think one of the things that these metaphors, I don't, my work is not very much in the X office right now, but I still have mutant characters in my texts, and I still want my texts to talk about current events. And one thing a metaphor can do is it can strip away um, the vantage point that is limiting a reader, that it can remove the apparatus that is holding them in one place and let them see it from another angle. Um, there are readers who already share your politics. There are readers who already get it. And for them, I think that that stripping away can help um, give them a toolbox and a vocabulary to talk about these issues that is without. And I think with people, something has happened in fan spaces where it's become much more consumptive. We're no longer um, fans react less as though they are contributors to the work. I think I grew up as you did in the 90s and 2000s where it's like, well, I have to write fan fiction and I have to, if I want these things, I have to be an active participant in them. And that sense has kind of removed. People want things to be canon, people want things to be explicit, which I understand and agree with. But the flip side of that is that all metaphors go both ways. They're not just for you to see and identify, but they are ways they give you a vocabulary to talk about in the world. So when these systems produce new ways of enacting these horrors, like then we have a vocabulary already in place. We recognize like what you're doing is like what Senator Kelly was doing. What you're doing um, is like what Hydra was doing to these immigrant stories in Avengers Academy, right? Like it does allow you, I mean, these are also, this is Disney, right? Like its audience is vast and its readership is also a huge cross-section. Like I can write for 100 years and my audience, by the nature of my writing, will never be the sort of 11-year-old kid that I was that needs these things. So talking about these things sub rosa, an 11-year-old can't buy my book Dayspring, but they could buy Avengers Academy and see like, oh, this sounds like what my parents are saying, but the bad guys are saying it, you know? Um, so that to me is also important and easy to lose track of when you start to imagine the audience is all just like you. When the audience is a broader swath of people and ages and backgrounds, your text becomes the space where they're meeting and negotiating a common polis and a common ethic, I think.
As an example of that kind of work, can you describe Early Thaw and talk a little bit about your process for writing it?
Yeah, Early Thaw was a story. I think it's only 5 pages long, but it's a story I wrote about Iceman as a teenager. And it starts with 3 panels that are real. They're from the Lee and Kirby run of X-Men. I think it's issue 11 or 13. I would want to check. Um, but it's a moment very early on in Stan Lee and Kirby's X-Men where Iceman is helping Warren Angel strap down his wings, which is a thing Xavier always makes him do, so he can hide them inside kind of a baggy suit. And in that comic, Bobby, Iceman asks Warren, like, would it be so bad if people knew about us here, if people saw your wings? And Warren says, yeah, that would be the end of us. And I was always sort of interested in what that would mean for Bobby, who is not visibly mutated. He passes when he wants to. He can look like ice, but he doesn't have to. But he is a closeted queer character growing up in a home with Charles Xavier running the show and telling you every day you have to hide, you have to pass. So Stanley and Kirby's issue goes left and mine goes right, and it just sort of follows Bobby's thoughts about that horrible moment. One of the things we have to grapple with in X-Men is like, why did Bobby Drake come out so late? Writers have been trying to out Bobby since early 80, mid 80s, early 90s. Certainly Scott Lobdell writes Bobby as consistently trying to, for example, tell Jean Grey his secret or grapple with Emma Frost about what it is that's limiting his powers. And the subtext here is pretty clear. Um, but to me, Bobby's late coming out is so obviously a trauma response to growing up with the centrism of Charles Xavier that he grew up in a world where he was taught that his difference has to be made passable and has to be made invisible to the larger community. And so Early Thaw is just the story of Bobby's crush on Warren, which he knows is inarticulable, and then a conversation he has with Magneto about it, um, where Magneto has attacked the school or is about to attack the school, and he sees Bobby and he stops for a moment to talk to him about what it would mean to come out and that it's true, the world is not safe, but that is not a reason to just disappear, and that the work both Xavier and Magneto are doing is for the better world that Bobby deserves.
What kind of feedback did you get from queer readers about that story?
Overwhelming. It's been really amazing. I still think it is one of the moments. I've only worked in the X office once, and it was for that story. And if it's the only crack at the plate I ever get, I'm very proud of it. I think that it, to me, summarizes so much about what X-Men meant to me as a kid. I was Bobby. I was sort of struggling and trapped. But also to me is such a manifesto of what these books can do and be. Um, and the fans certainly understood what I was doing and have been every so often it goes viral again on Tumblr or Twitter or whatever. Um, because I think it speaks to people of that experience and what these stories meant to them. And I'm so grateful I even got to do those 5 pages.
Do you have a favorite character, either inside the core X-Men or out, that is your favorite to write for?
It's funny, like I think the job so much is to sort of fall in love with these characters as they come to you. Like whenever I get my hands on one, it's like, well, what makes this character work? I think falling in love with them is kind of the job. Um, the mutant I've had the most chance to write is Escapade, the character that Charlie Jane Anders created, the trans superhero who is currently in Avengers Academy. I've kind of become very um, protective of her and proud of her as she's been growing and sort of learning the spaces she moves in. I always like a weirdo. I've never been someone who's like power scaling, like who's the strongest. Although I did love Magneto, I still love Magneto. He's very important to me. Um, but I love a weird little Blorbo. So like lately I've become obsessed with Emplate, who is another character that I feel like history has kind of rolled past, but I recognize in his sort of belief in himself as a monster, um, some version of myself. I'm usually drawn to these sort of traumatized, these mutants whose mutation has been a trauma and who have felt limited and marked by it for life has always mattered to me. I similarly love Exodus because he's a weird medieval like Christian whose mutation hit several centuries before everyone else and who has sort of used that as the way he has sort of recreated himself and empowered himself over the years. I like a weird villainous monster on the margins of these societies.
Have you found any place that is either like the Academy or like Magneto's Lair, like a place where you feel like, ah, this is my group. These are
Oh,
my people.
yeah, I think that when I finished grad school, I started working at the Glad Day bookshop here in Toronto. It's the oldest surviving LGBT bookstore in the world, and I came on board just as they were sort of themselves mutating into something new. They were turning into an event space for a broader, their mandate was really to broaden service to the rest of the LGBT community. It was a gay bookstore that sold poppers for a long time. And now it was sort of a space for queer and trans readings and representation and literary events and drag shows and brunches and all these things. And that was the first moment where I was like, oh, this is what it's supposed to feel like. And since then, I've been running my own screening series, Dumpster Raccoon Cinema, here in Toronto, which is all about queer camp, all about sort of celebrating these damaged, strange, forgotten films, or misunderstood films. And the community that has emerged around it has been, to me, a reflection of that project and a reflection of my own project of like finding queer weirdos and bringing them into community together.
And then looking back at those early X-Men films, are there aspects today that you read differently or that feel maybe more timely?
I was struck rewatching it just how thoroughly the script is interested in a pretty obvious queer metaphor to me, like, and even more so in two when we have Bobby sort of be like, his mom is like, have you tried not being a mutant? Like, it wears its heart on its sleeve. Um, I was surprised at how interested in and willing it is to articulate itself in those terms and how gentle and nurturing and thoughtful they are at a script level about the fantasy of the Xavier School and the fantasy of being held in community. There's a lot of scenes of like Rogue playing pinball and like the mansion feels like a safe place. Um, and that to me, I think is an instinct and an impulse that is hard to imagine a blockbuster taking the time for in 2025. Um, if this franchise ever comes back, that is the part I think is most important. It is the part that is the least expensive but a script willing to. I always liked the my own book, Avengers Academy, is all about this. Like I like the scenes of characters just hanging out and being friends. I think it was when I was a kid my favorite part of the X-Men books and remains so now. I think as much as we want to see these people punching things and shooting laser beams and stuff, what makes them work, the thing Stanley said, I read when I was a kid, I had an anthology of short stories by a bunch of comic book writers. And Stan Lee wrote the foreword, and he said, "The secret of the X-Men is, for all their powers, this is just a soap opera. And the stakes are the stakes of a soap opera, where it's like who loves who, who's friends with who's fighting with who. And when you understand that, then you understand the X-Men. And that to me is what the movie gets right. And that to me is the thing most worth preserving about this mythos and this franchise.
How much thought have you given to what your mutant power would be?
I think the power that I would want is the one that's pretty revealing psychologically. Like I've always been jealous of Mystique. Um, the both the sort of the power of it, but also I think the sadness of it. Like, what if you could just make yourself exactly what the world wanted? Has been a struggle for me and for therapy. And I think it's an impulse. I'm obsessed with costuming. I'm dressing up constantly in my own work. Um, and that to me was the one I always wanted. What about you?
Oh gosh, it's funny you say that because I really love there's a scene in two where Mystique and Nightcrawler are talking, and
Right.
I've always felt very close to Nightcrawler in that like I love the ability to to make a dramatic exit, but to like to travel, to transport, and all to be there 1 second and not there the next. And I think he's also the way that I imagine myself using Nightcrawler's power is being in a space without being noticed because nobody saw you come in. Like that is, I think, the aspect of it that
Ah.
interests me.
No one ever remembers this, but he literally also among his powers is that he can't be seen in shadow. Um, he's invisible when he's in shadow, is a power that Claremont tried to give him very early on that people kind of forget he has sometimes. But yeah, he's as much as he's so visibly mutated, he also can blend in very well when he wants to. Um, and that dichotomy is interesting to me always. The same is true of Mystique, this sort of like I was a person who had to learn to pass the stakes were incredibly high as a young person that I had to pass. It was the only way to survive. And when I choose not to pass now, that is political and that is a choice that I'm making and that I think about a lot. That moment with Mystique and Nightcrawler where he asks like, why not just always look like them? And she says, because we shouldn't have to. That to me is like such a perfect encapsulation of so much of the politics of this series. And its grasp is so strong of what the work of these disparate and fighting communities is. Like, what are the stakes of this? Is what Mystique believes is that she's fighting for a world where her blue skin is just as able to walk down the street as her ability to look like everyone else. And that to me has always spoken to me.
I do love that. Oh gosh, that line of dialogue. Like even just hearing it just now, it gave me goosebumps.
It's so
That
good.
she can and she very politically refuses not to. It reminds me. It makes me think so much of that the thing of like why are they shoving it down our throats? Like about queer people. Like oh why are they making themselves? The shove it down our throats thing. And when I'm really feeling my queer rage, my response to that is so that we don't cut your throat instead. And
Right. Yeah. Even her visual, like as much as it is sort of a limitation of the CGI, like she won't even put on clothes.
yes.
Like,
Oh my
like
gosh. Yes.
you will look at her body, which is beautiful. Like objectively, the makeup work is so stunning in it. Similarly, like her hair is only slicked back so that she's easier to CGI, but like this kind of like very queer mullety thing that she's doing, she is beautiful and different. And uncompromising and unapologetic in such an exciting way that has always spoken to me and I've always been envious of.
I'm just watching now the second season of Sandman, and I keep noticing how Desire has very similar hair to Mystique. Like it's
Mm,
the same kind of wet, slicked, sort
yeah,
of
yeah.
like close to the head sort of thing. And I don't know what they're, what that says about like the way that hair is encoded in our reptile brains. But I don't know, something about it just
Yeah. I mean, and
it
Mystique has since her inception, she was written as a queer character. Like Claremont was as explicit as he could be about Mystique's queerness. It's only very recently we've been allowed to sort of tell the story of just how queer her family has been all this time. But if you look at the original text, like he's sneaking clues in past the censors as much as he can. Destiny is called her lemon, her lemon, which is like ancient medieval term for like a loved one, and they could get away with it just because the standards and practices didn't know what it meant. Um, and yeah, so she, the way Mystique collects and accrues queer iconography has always been striking to me.
If folks want to check out your work and connect with you online, where should they go?
Oh, you can read Avengers Academy on Marvel Unlimited. We're probably around issue 60 by the time this comes out. You can follow me on most platforms at Mea Koopa, Meakoopa, which is a bad Latin Super Mario joke, which we talked about on the first podcast I ever did publicly, way back when on Sewers of Paris. And yeah, you can follow my Patreon, which is patreon.com/meakoopa, where I do a podcast about Christian literature. I'm everywhere. You can't get away from me.
Fabulous. Anthony, thank you so much for chatting with me. Always a
Oh,
pleasure.
my very great pleasure, Matt. Thank you for having me and for doing this project.